he's related to either one of us, Robert. He's an economist in Moncton. He writes a blog called it's in helping the economic and social development of our province, and that's what he writes about. He wrote a column recently in which he stated that in New Brunswick, $300 million each and every year is spent by all three levels of government on economic development. That's been going on for a long while. Arguably, we don't have a great deal to show for that money. If you're looking for a source of funds that might help the universities in this province do a better job in regard to economic and social, cultural development, I think there's a very good argument that some of that money could be put to better use.
It's easy for me to say this at the nature of the university that I'm at, but I mean, right-sizing may be something that differentiates us. I guess I'm not of a school that believes that growth solves everything. And, you know, this is a small province, you know, a small demographic and limited public resources. And it may be that we just got to say, well, generally speaking, what's the right or appropriate size for the infrastructure of universities that we have? I'm not talking here about closing down units or what have you. It's just right-sizing what we have, and then if we have a sense of a ballpark of what that happens, then working backwards in a collaborative way and in partnerships to see how we can exercise that. I just do fear that there's a huge cannibalizing effort that's going on, particularly in the Maritimes, where we're all struggling over the same number of students. We're increasing the cost of our recruiting the same number of students. Similarly with the international, and this is not meant. This is without prejudice to what you said, is that recruiting international students is a heck of a lot more expensive than recruiting domestic students, and the delivery of programs to international students is more expensive, you're going to do it well, than to domestic students. So it seems to me before one goes into a kind of a growth model as the kind of an angle, we have to at least reflect on what's the right size of, what's the appropriate size going forward, given that the issue is not just the short term. As Alex put it out, I think that this is something that's going to, long after I've left this job, it's somebody else's problem. But it strikes me that 20, 30 years from now, the problem is not going to be a lot different than the shape it is right now.
Alex?
I just wanted to comment on the particular situation that the University of Moncton finds itself in. When you start talking about things like right-sizing, I understand very well where you're coming from, Robert. The thing is that the University of Moncton, that presents particular challenges in that we are the only Francophone university in New Brunswick. Therefore, what must we do to well serve the population for which we are supposed to serve, except offer as much of everything as we possibly can? And that causes big, big problems. I mean, if you're three children in a family, and in an Anglophone family in New Brunswick, one wants to take journalism, one wants to take forestry, and one wants to take a liberal arts education, each one of those three children could actually be going to 3 different universities. The Francophone child is not like that. He's only got one choice. He's only got one choice. And it makes that the university offers a lot, and when you offer a lot, you dilute your offering capacity, and you support classes that are 50% of which are below 20 students. So it's a particular situation for Moncton.
Yeah, I'm not clear in New Brunswick the extent to which the search for international students is well connected with the immigration process. And I don't, because I'll tell you, one of the things that I have seen in the last 12 months is, particularly Manitoba, which is a province obviously New Brunswick often gets compared to in terms of size, they have really done a number on that in the last 12 to 24 months by saying, in effect, and of course you've got different provincial rules on employment, they basically said if you graduate from a Manitoba university, you have an automatic right to stay here permanently. And so with the tax credit, which is very similar to the tax credit here, their pitch to students in China, students in India, students in Thailand, wherever, is come here, we pay for your education, and you can work here. And so it becomes the route into immigration, and certainly given the demographic challenges you have here, that becomes a big issue. It could be a big plus.
So let me just respond by saying the previous government moved the Population Growth Secretariat out of Business New Brunswick and into the Department of Post-Secondary Education, Training and Labor, which was a signal that they were thinking along the same lines. And I know those are conversations we've been waiting to have with the present government to see if they have the same interest.
I think one of the things we can't lose sight of is how successful our neighbor next door has been with regard to recruiting students from out of province. In Nova Scotia, there are about 10,000 students that arrive every year. They're Medicared by somebody else, they're student loaned by somebody else, they're cared for by somebody else. And interestingly enough, 22% of the students that go to Nova Scotia from outside of Nova Scotia stay. Much more successful than their immigration policy, a heck of a lot more successful than our immigration policy. And it's an investment from an economic development point of view of all those kids in Nova Scotia. It's also an investment for the ones that are going to stay. The other thing it adds to Nova Scotia is that diversity. I would love to have students of a more diverse nature on my campus. It's a pretty white-looking outfit, let me tell you. And most of us are. But what we need is that diversity so that you have that cultural exchange, that different ideas. That's a factor you can't put a price on. So what I'm saying, before we deal with our capacity question, let's try to fill up what we've got. But what we've got to do is get our act together. There's no sense Eddy and I going to India and me saying, I've got a great liberal arts program, you've got a great arts program. We might have to go and say, I've got an arts program, you've got a science one, you've got an engineering one, you take education, I'll give up my part. I think that's the kind of cooperation that people would expect us to do. And you know, another story, obviously, when you're dealing with a French first language, because it's a different group of countries and a different number of students. And Robert has a different niche, I think, out there too. But I think that's the kind of leadership we're expecting to put together as a group, but we're also expecting the province to play a role in that.
Yeah. Maybe now is a good time to point out, I think the bar is open.
In a few minutes, Eddy.
Good point.
Let's go.
Just to carry on a bit on what Dennis has said, and was one of the points I didn't have time to make, was that in 2003, the University of Moncton had 5% of its student population was international in 2003. In 2010, it is now 12%. So we have significantly gone abroad and recruited students. The other point that I wanted to make was that cultural diversity that you talked about. It's very present on campus, and it's very much appreciated. However, government efforts, especially for, and no, I shouldn't say especially, government efforts have not necessarily been in tune with efforts on the part of universities, whether they be Francophone or Anglophone universities. I mean, you've got a demographic secretariat, you've got a declining population in both cultural groups, declining population that is going to have serious repercussions on our universities, and there is no other more important point of entry for international people in the province of New Brunswick than through the universities. You name me another institution that is capable of bringing international people more than universities, I can't think of it. With all the respect we owe to the McCains and the Irvings and the Ganongs, I don't think they bring as many international people into this province as our four universities do. For the University of Moncton, which our greatest competitor is, guess who? Quebec. We have our students that come in September. They arrive at the University of Moncton. They are not, differential fees are not waived. Therefore, it's $8,000 or plus a year. And their cousin that's at the University of Laval calls up and says, hey, you can do it here for $1,700. Where do you think we fit?
I have a question, sorry. Okay. I have a question I wanted to raise based on something that Alec has written about, but which I think is pertinent to some of what you have been talking about. One of the mantras of our universities has been, you've got to define your own niche. You've got to define your own space, your own place. And at the same time, we're talking about, but we need student mobility. A student should be able to move around from institution to institution, and more this will be part of their student experience. How do you reconcile the need to be different from everybody else and the need to be like enough everybody else that people can actually do that moving? This, I think, is part of the supply demand. It's part of what you have to deal with in Moncton, trying to provide everything for everybody because nobody else can do it. Eddie, Eddie first, and then Robert.
I was just going to say, I would, if I could wave a magic wand, then every student at the University of New Brunswick, and I would pick the first term of third year, would spend that at a university abroad. Leaving aside some of the professional programs with their accreditation issues, I think virtually every student at the University of Brunswick could do those courses as electives at worst. And it's difficult to imagine that many of them wouldn't fit into some kind of major program as well. But
yeah, I think what students, contemporary students are looking for is a very sharply defined experience. They want an intense experience. They emphasize the word experience. So I don't see a contradiction in, for example, to do a reduction out of service, all universities be completely different with their own niches, and to go away in third year to a different experience. We're negotiating something right now with a university on the other side of the country that has almost nothing in common with our university. So if you decide to come to a small liberal arts university, maybe you want to get a different kind of experience, go off to a big university with big professional schools or what have you for a term and see what that's like, and what have you. So I take your point, but I don't see that as a contradiction. I think that's what's really, really important for the long run is that we have very specific and concrete reasons why students come to our university as opposed to somebody else. That's what I think is how we're going to survive over the long term.
You want to comment on that, Alec? This was your comment in one of your papers. Yeah.
Institutions, Canadian institutions have had trouble developing a vocabulary around quality assessment. And because of that, we've had a difficulty developing a way of recognizing the equivalence of not just, we're not bad at recognizing credentials most of the time. I know that a BA from UNB is going to be pretty much what UBC is. But within BC, there's a lot of arguments about whether or not a degree from, Vancouver Island Institute is the same as somewhere else. So government, and I don't mean to put governments as a third person here, but we've had this trouble every time we try to expand education to create a new type of institution, we create all these arguments about whether or not it's the same. And we've developed a very fractured system in the sense that it isn't very easy to move credits from one institution to another in different parts of the country or even within a province. In Europe, the way they've gone about this is through the Bologna process and something called the European Credit Transfer System. But underlying that is a set of agreements about how do I define a credit. There's a fascinating argument, actually. This was at the AUCC meeting a couple of years ago, and Morton Mendelsohn from McGill, he asked people, he said, okay, so how many universities in this room have a definition of a credit? And I think only about half the people put their hands up. And then he said, now how many of you have a definition of a credit that isn't based on the number of hours someone spends in the classroom? And no hands went up. So in Europe, what they've done is they've tried to estimate the amount of effort that goes into a credit. Now that's a way, in a sense, of kind of standardizing things and modularizing the basics of education. Now, obviously, everybody wants to have a niche experience. It's exactly, you want to be able to array those credits in particular ways that create a certain experience. But at the same time, you need to have the sort of basic quality control and basic general understanding about what underlies each of those modules that allows you to do that kind of credit transfer. Canada, is the country that works in practice but not in theory. And I think at universities we have this same problem, which is something like Bologna is very theoretical. We have a really hard time trusting it. And so the facts on the ground remain complicated. It's not something we're good at. I think as we get more involved in international education, as we move towards a free trade deal with the European Union, which involves the free movement of skilled professionals, you know, what the reason they have the Bologna process is because they needed to have people move back and forth. They need to be able to recognize credentials. We're going to have to get better at it. And that's not something from New Brunswick. I think it'd be fantastic for New Brunswick if someone from here said, we're the ones who are going to do it. We're going to start this. But I think in the end, that's something you don't do inside a province. You do it nationally, and hopefully you do it with some eye on international standards, particularly when in Asia and Latin America, you're increasingly getting Bologna or Bologna-like structures. So.
Thank you. I think we're just about finished the sort of inter-institutional dialogue, and it's time now to open the floor for questions. I'm not sure who's passing mics around. Aha, Sandra is passing a mic. When you ask your question, could you address it either to a specific individual or to the whole group, and they can all have at it at once if they so please. Please keep your questions brief, just so we can maximize the time available. That's Barry Ogden.
Hi. Like you, I agree that cooperation and education and thinking outside the box will change our society. But I think there's one population that hasn't been talked about here, and this is just coming from a Saint Johner, is that I know that in the last couple of years I've gotten together with a number of institutions in Atlantic Canada, mostly urban institutions, and we've been sharing sort of data about how many post-secondary students in each community. And Saint John, which has the highest poverty rate in the province and one of the highest in Canada, also has one of the lowest numbers of post-secondary students. And that's a population that I don't think that we're allowing them to have access to post-secondary. It's geography, it's distance, which is all compounded because of money cost. But I think that when I look at the size of our campus, and our number of post-secondary students compared to the size of our community and the amount of taxes we pay and such, is that is a population that we could go after, that, you know, if we can create a better access for that population. We have large number of slums and food banks and everything else, and if we really want to change Saint John, that is a population that we have to go after. Okay, thank you.
Eddy?
I would just like to, that is the intent of the effort that we're making with Hayes and White and St. Francis, is exactly to address that particular issue. I would also, I'm planning on making a trip to high schools throughout the province, not to talk up UNB, but to talk up the importance of students in our province choosing post-secondary education, whether it be the college or any one of the universities here. I think that is just, I mean, there's two fundamental reasons. One is economic. You'll realize far more income by going off to post-secondary. And the other one, I think, is emotional. Your chances of getting a job that you will truly love skyrocket if you have a post-secondary education.
Robert, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah,
too?
just very, very briefly. So I can't talk to the St. John situation, but in general, I think the previous government, not playing favorites here, was aware of that and did put some money and some direction into looking for innovative ways of increasing accessibility to the system. I think that there is a broad general statistic that says that the participation rate in New Brunswick in post-secondary education is pretty high. Okay, then there's the famous lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? That there are certain parts of the population that are not accessing and what have you. And so there are a number of programs, I'm happy to talk to you about them, that are in place to try to project the university to communities that normally have not considered it. And I'll just give one example of how collaboration is beginning to work in this province, working between the universities and the community college system. Let's say a kid drops out of high school, goes and works in a job for a few years, has no high school diploma, runs out of opportunities after a few years, maybe considering going back to get education. That person is really hampered by the absence of a high school degree. What the universities and community colleges are doing is developing a program. It will be a joint program in which anyone who takes the program, if they pass that program, is eligible to any community college or university in the country, regardless of the fact that they have a high school, in the province, regardless if they have a high school degree or not. So that's just one small example of a number, but I agree with you. That's an untapped resource, and particularly for young males.
We have another questioner out here on the floor.
This will be a rather difficult and challenging question because it comes from the past. Most educational universities come from, shall we say, the source of quality. That is, a faith in God and the things that we learn from a faith in God, principles, etc., and so on. Quality, in other words. Now, our forefathers, of course, came forward with the benefit of this in their lives. Their character was saturated with honesty, with goodness, etc. Now the challenge is today, how do we bring forward the things that are really, shall I say, eternal or lasting, the things that really make quality in character, etc. Because I find in universities, for example, among the students, they hardly know where to go. They hardly know what's up or down. As a matter of fact, all forms of cheating, all forms of things that we wouldn't like to have our sons and daughters employed with. And now, in other words, what can we carry forward in a positive, helpful way in the universities today?
Would you like that to go to everybody, or have you a particular respondent?
My name is Reverend Lloyd Kiss.
Anyone want to start this?
Just if I could answer that by going back to the question over there a little bit about, one of the things we have to make sure is that our school system is all connected, and that we have values and we have standards all the way through. And you know, students coming out of high school, we have to try to make sure they have a chance of success when they get to the community college or to university. And I think what we all have an obligation to do in our system is to demand a certain level of time on task, quality, accountability. All those things are values that I think we have to instill in our children, and we have to do it right from the beginning. You can't do it at the 13th year, you can't not do it at the 5th year. And I think what we have to do as a society is have high expectations for our young people and hold them accountable when they don't.
Neil.
I tend to agree with. I tend to agree with Dennis that when you get 18 or 19 or 20 or 21 years old, it might be a bit late to start to instill values, the values that you are talking about, Father. If it's any consolation, we are totally revamping the undergraduate programs at the University of Moncton, and in the revamp, there are 30 credits that must be met by the students. They're called credits of general learning. And one of the objectives of general learning that must be attained is good citizenship and social responsibility. So we're trying to instill that into our curriculum. I don't think it's a panacea, but at least we're working on it.
Oh, Wendy, sorry.
Wendy Robbins from UNB Fredericton, 26-year veteran. But longer than that, I started my career in the 1970s in Ontario, actually. And some of the things you're saying tonight, maybe not with the same dire tones, but almost, it was said then. I spent the first 10 years of my career as a sessional because nobody wanted to offer a permanent position because of all the predictions when the baby boom already was becoming the baby bust. And what saved everybody's skin, of course, was women, right? In those days, 1/3 of the class was women, and we know for the last 2 decades, the majority of students have been women. But we're still not there at the graduate level, right? We still haven't reached PhD parity in this country, although they have in the United States, and I would predict within the next half dozen years we will too. If we were to make graduate education more compatible with having children, it would benefit everybody, but of course it would most particularly benefit the women who are bearing the children. We need to think about that. There are any number of women that I know who've dropped out of a graduate degree, not because they didn't have the talent, and in some cases it wasn't because they didn't have the money, they just didn't have the time to piece it all together. There's also lots of military people coming back who will be looking for new careers. One of the most moving graduations I ever attended anywhere was at St. Thomas University a few years back, when an 80-year-old South African woman who had been born under apartheid, you all know Mama Alice, she's moved to Nova Scotia, it's a loss for us. Phenomenal person who did it, right? And she had to do it by starting to get her high school credentials in order. It took her a decade or more. She did it. And there's tons of people who won't be going to university in the 19 to 24 demographic, and who won't necessarily want an economic advantage by going to university, but they will want to have an opportunity to do things that they never could do before, possibly because they didn't have the time. And that's taking individual courses, often in the humanities, the side of campus that is so devalued. They'll come back, they'll take music, they'll take a language, they'll take history, they'll take English or French. It's bound to be a benefit to the health budget, because active seniors who keep their mind alert, who learn new things, don't depend upon the medical system for as many ailments as if they don't keep active. So that's my spiel. We have to look for, I don't know if we're going to have to look for it, it's there. It's the poor people, it's the Aboriginal people, it's the older people. It's still a large number of women who never got to university in this province in their time. So I think if we stop thinking just about that young group and think about the whole benefit of a university education at all ages and talk a little more about lifelong learning, we find a way forward. Thank you.
Does anyone want to respond? Was there another question back there? Yes.
It's Jim Lutz. I like Dennis's idea of collaboration among the four presidents here, and I'm curious on the matter of IP, intellectual property development of the universities, whether if you were to take that as the first place where you really choose to collaborate heavily, whether you think that university governance has a role in directing your research. I mean, if you could develop, I think there's a fourth option to Alex's direction where the universities could create value, is if you created commercial IP. So if you first collaborated and marshaled your resources and then really attacked it from a commercial perspective. So I guess my question is, to what extent do you think university governance should have a role in directing your research efforts so you may have a higher likelihood of creating commercializable IP?
Eddy.
Thank you for the question. The way your question has a direct impact on the concept of academic freedom at our universities. What we do, our faculty members are essentially independent contractors when it comes to their research. And I believe the vehicles that I talked about this evening, for example, Springboard and the other vehicles that we have in place, allow those faculty members who believe they have something to offer in that regard to become involved in those activities. Furthermore, because of the productivity and innovation gaps that I mentioned towards when I was just about dinged in my own building.
Hey, we put this building together.
Those productivity and innovation gaps are going to lead to more and more government programs that are going to facilitate university-industry interactions. And those will not be of a coercive or directive nature, but rather they will offer faculty members the opportunity to become involved as they have an interest. And I think that, in fact, will be extremely powerful.
Alex?
I'm way more pessimistic than that. I was at AUCC back in 96, 97, 98, which was when the Canada Foundation for Innovation was created. And I remember the kind of rhetoric that universities were using 10, 15 years ago when universities said, yes, put the money in research. And this is, since then, if the granting council budgets have almost doubled since then, you get CFI, you get billions and billions of dollars that have gone in there. I was shocked the other day to read Statistics Canada that the combined IP output of universities, that is the commercialized, was in the 50 million range. Now, the University of Washington alone comes out about 200 million a year in the United States. The idea that what universities in Canada, like when universities made the case for more government spending, on research because it'll pay dividends and things like IP. I guarantee you 10 years ago, the promises universities were making to government were a lot higher than $50 million a year. We've got a problem in commercialization. And I'm not suggesting it's a university's only problem, okay? Like it takes two to tango here in commercialization, right? We have an economy. We simply may not be putting money in research where there is commercialization opportunities in Canada. We're dealt, I mean, I know the statistics that you're talking about, we don't spend as much of our percentage of GDP on R&D, and it's private R&D, it's not the public R&D. I get all that. But it seems to me that each country, given on the kind of array of industries that it's got, is actually dealt a very different hand in terms of the maximum R&D you can expect. If you don't have a computer industry, a domestic computer industry of any size, and apparently we don't now that we've, sent Nortel to the chop shop, you can put all your money you want in that sector, and it's not going to create commercialization. Sectors like forestry and mining, which is a big part of the Canadian economy, fisheries, natural resources generally, doesn't matter where you are in the world. Companies don't put a lot of money into R&D. And we aren't putting money, our scientific money, our research money is not going to mining engineering. It's not going to forestry programs in the same kind of numbers as it's going to some other areas. So it seems to me we've got a pretty significant mismatch there that is probably part of the answer here. Until we figure that out, the Finns are really good at this, right? The Finns are really good at putting money into things like forestry, and they've got MAs and how do you get, forestry products out. They're good at it. We're not. I'm not sure why that is.
Well let me respond.
I won't ding you, Eddy,
mostly, I think we'll have to take it outside.
Yeah.
But while I have the floor, I spent a lot of time in Ottawa, and I think we have a big problem where in Ottawa we have people referring to the forestry industry, for example, as a sunset industry. I mean, it's unbelievably short-sighted to believe that in Canada, forestry is not going to be a major part of our economy long into the future. But you have serious people making that argument. On the other hand, they're all too willing to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the auto sector. Could have something to do with votes in Ontario. I'm not sure. But there's a much longer conversation that has to be had around. Let me make the point about metrics, Alex. You raised a very important issue. Any government program that we create, which involves the spending of any funds, and they all do, creates a constituency, a group of people who think it's the best thing since sliced bread because they benefit. But what we're really measuring when we look at that is popularity. And I really think we need to have an agreed upon set of metrics that define success, and we test our programs against whether or not they are successful, not whether or not they are popular. And we do not do that as a country, or as a province.
I think one of the things we have to get is a balance. Depending if you're a teaching institution, you can also have a balance of research, but we can't lose sight of the fact that we do teach young people. There is a role for research, and I think we should look at where that's done best and support that. I know there was a thing from the universities across the country, the Big Seven, said, oh, it should just be us. And that's not reasonable at all. We have a very small private sector R&D operation in Atlantic Canada, and there's got to be some effort by the government to kind of balance that out. So what we've got to do, I think, is encourage research, but also respect the teaching. And there is a balance there that we have an obligation in the small jurisdiction to make sure we find.
There's a question back here. Yeah.
This is a question that relates to an article in the Globe and Mail this morning, and it's on who and how we choose who goes to our universities, the methodologies in place. And it was interesting because the impact in this article addressed medical students in particular here in Canada, and the fact that marks are no longer the only indicator of who comes to our schools. And Dennis, you might want to answer that only because it changes the students and the backgrounds of people who are attending our schools and what they bring back to us in terms of economic diversity and diversity in the schools themselves.
Was that, Robert, go ahead.
Sure, you're referring to, I think, an article in the Globe and Mail this morning about criteria for application to med school, to McMaster. I'm not going to comment on that, but not to avoid the question, but which is a good one, but to raise a larger issue about the mission of university. What the article was basically saying is that it was found that in terms of the outputs, that is the proof of the pudding of medical training, that very often the students with the highest grades coming into med school didn't turn out to be the best doctors. And again, one doesn't want to generalize about that, but to say that there were other skills that one was looking for in a practicing profession like that. Indeed, like a specialist, right? Specialist, like liking human beings or being able to relate to them, and the fact is that a lot of those skills, with those life skills or experiential skills, aren't taught in classroom settings, aren't taught in particular programs, and indeed, there's a certain amount of pressure expectations of university that their experience be more than simply a training experience, and then that's one of the big differences between Europe and us. There's simply a different university tradition in Europe. It's more a labor market orientation tradition. The North American tradition has been far more a citizenship orientation, and there's a lot of pressure on us universities from the students themselves to give them that kind of experiential learning and what have you. That actually throws up another cost to the university. If you look at the range of things that go on in a university in Canada today compared to 20 or 30 years ago, we provide far more in the way of programming and support to students, whether it's from counseling or what have you, to sort of assist extracurricular activities. And if you compare what we do with even the most middle-of-the-road Canadian university compared to any good university in Europe, the range of our programming and support is just so far and beyond, it's unimaginable, the comparison. So I agree with you. I think that, yes, we have to, it's a necessary condition that we train that we give our students a good crack at a labor force. There's no two ways about that. We don't want to cripple them going out, but that's not our only responsibility. Our responsibility is also a much broader one in terms of making them good citizens and what have you, and providing an experience that will make them competitive to get into McMaster of Medical School and now McGill.
Pat Dara has a question. Thank you, Robert.
It wouldn't be fair if I left without asking one. Pat Dara, I've been honored by receiving an honorary degree from UNB, but I want to go back to what Dennis started at the start when he gave in his speech about his structural costs. He talked about his professors not being there and other people not being there, and I participated in the study of all your institutions in regards to the financial formula that the Maritime Higher Education has given you over the last 10 years, so I know the dire straits of your finances. But I think at the same time, I just want to ask each of you how you were addressing the structural things that have come to you through collective bargaining and other aspects over the last 50 years. And because if you're not, you have to address those structural costs if government is going to go back at those issues. So I guess the question I have, you don't have to answer it all tonight, is what are you doing to address the structural costs that have the universities have gathered among themselves over the last 50 years. And I just want to say, in fairness to all of you, I've done collective bargaining for 40 years and given away a lot of things I wish I could take back. But I would like to say to you, what are you going to address those? Because the public is not going to move that far in the financing of universities till they find out that you're going to address the structural problems you have.
Would anyone like to start a 10-year conversation here?
Well, sure, I'm willing to start. We at the University of New Brunswick, we have very vigorous cost controls. I think any one of the faculty members on any of our campus will tell you our efforts to contain costs have been very rigorous indeed. We've taken, I believe it's some $14 million out of the university budget since 2005. That's been a very difficult exercise, but we've done it, and you know what? We're not yet finished. We have more work to do. So the fundamental difficulty you have is you will run into people who claim that the funding model for universities is broken. Our inflation rate is on the order of 2 to 4%. It's typically a couple of percentage points larger than the consumer price index. Governments are not increasing our funding anything like that. Here in New Brunswick, our tuition fee environment is the second highest in the country, which would indicate that perhaps our ability to raise tuition fees on our students may be somewhere near the top. And so there's no choice but to be extremely vigorous in containing our costs. And as Alex was suggesting earlier, looking at other revenues by which we can diversify our revenue, whether that means getting out there and trying to attract international students, whether that means getting involved more in professional development activities, whatever it is. We're seriously looking at all of those opportunities. And I can't imagine it's not similar at all of the institutions here.
Robert.
Hello, my name is Robert McKinnon. I'm the Vice President of UNB Saint John. My question is for Alex Usher. As you've heard tonight, as the President has indicated, we have a recently minted and recently approved strategic plan, and our President has charged the Vice Presidents with the task of developing an implementation plan.
That's what you have them
So
for.
my question is in your experience across Canada and in the US, are there some examples of universities that have got it right in this fiscal environment and in this challenging environment? We've heard a lot about challenges tonight. From your experience, what are some examples of places that have got it right? We're working on getting it right, but what are some places that have got it right, and what are the distinguishing characteristics of those institutions?
I usually charge a lot for that. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it depends on which bit of it that you think you want to say is, have they got right? I mean, in terms of the actual point that, the signature transformative experience, I mean, I think you could look at a number of institutions that have found ways to do it. I mean, I think, for instance, a lot of institutions that have used capstone kinds of experiences, they found that very useful. So I would give an example. I'm just trying to think of one right off the bat. Business school at University of Victoria, which is one that I happen to know, where they just say, you know what, you're spending a term abroad. Everybody in that program spends term abroad. I think Queen's Business does that kind of stuff. Queen's Business is actually very good. That's another excellent example of those kinds of experiences where they said there's a particular type of relationship between professors and students. There's a particular way that we look at problems, and there's a particular set of experiences that are going to be common. And I think they're the ones who hit the nail on the head. And if you go a little bit further, the Western, not the Ivy program, but the sort of the undergraduate, the last 2 years in business that they do, and they've done a phenomenal job of right now. They charge $20,000 a year for that program, but they're spending $6,000 a year per student on the career placement thing at the outplacement at the back. So they're delivering an awful lot of value there. Again, those are examples, and they're primarily in professional programs rather than the broad arts. I mean, I think the Renaissance College here is a pretty good experience, right? I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that you want to do, and that's something you've already got a handle on. In terms of costs, there's an argument in universities that you're not a university graduate unless you've been taught by full-time, tenured PhDs, right? That's why I can't take something from, Algonquin College and take it to Carleton. Although those people, they don't have PhDs. Well, you know what? At a lot of universities, I'm being taught by, for a good chunk of year 1 and year 2, I'm being taught by people with MAs who are working on their PhDs, and that's who's giving it. So, to quote someone had said this. Look, I guess it was you, Eddie. It's not what it's what you do. It's not who you are. I think there's certainly a case for thinking about how much of the experience do you actually need the full-time research active professors doing. Get that question. Is this about who's teaching you, or is it about the knowledge you've learned at the back end? There's a very interesting study by a guy by the name of Vance Freed, who's at the University of Oklahoma, and he said, look, there's ways of delivering university education. He called it an Ivy-like experience, and you can argue about this, but he said, I can show you how to deliver top quality education for $7,000, $8,000 a student. And that's not tuition, that's total cost. He said, it all depends on what you want to build into your cost structure. How many research active profs do you need in each department? How many teaching profs do you need? Do you need sabbaticals, particularly if you're a teaching only kind of thing? Those are the questions you have to ask to really, and I think there are some questions they're asking. And in Europe, the way that question is being asked is through universities of applied science, right? Which is just a different model to get some of those same kinds of things. And they're worth looking at. They're worth looking at.
I'm being reminded by my coaches in the front row that we're just about out of time. At this point, I think I'm going to bring things to a formal close, but you're welcome to hang out for a while yet and continue this conversation. I think there is still refreshments at the back, but I would like on behalf of everyone here to thank all our speakers tonight, to thank UNB for hosting this series of conversations. I suspect the crystal ball is still a little cloudy, but we have certainly heard and discussed a lot of the issues that are going to be facing all our universities in the next 20, 30 years. So thank you very much to all of you, and thank you for coming.